So a lot of people would say that, well, you know, Hellenization and the whole Judaism was separate, but we know it cannot possibly be separate, because if you're trying to push a religion onto a people, you're not going to let them have a religion of their own, you know, as I said before. But the Romans allowed this whole thing to continue. Now, the one thing the Romans did, because they were smart, was like, well, you can't just have these people in Israel believing in this doctrine. We got to get everybody else. So they got to get their own people. You got to get the Greeks to start becoming Jews and believing in this whole Jewish doctrine. So Judaism spread into Greece, of course. Now we know today the oldest Jewish synagogue in the world is in Greece. It's in Delos, Greece, and it dates back to 150 to about 120 BCE. So we know that was around the time when the Romans was conquering the Greeks. Now, the whole thing you got to remember is this. The Old Testament they was using back then is not the same as the one we have today. It was completely different. Now, this is the reason why when they show you the Dead Sea Scrolls, they don't give you a complete version. They give you a bunch of fragments and a bunch of little shards and papers saying that this is all we have. They found over 800 manuscripts in those caves, and they can't give you a complete copy of the Old Testament because it's different from the one you have today. Now, we know about the Jewish war that Josephus writes about. The reason why that war started is because the Jews in Israel believed that their doctrine was being fulfilled, that their prophecy was coming true, and they had a warrior that was going to lead them to victory against the Romans, or against their oppressors, who happened to be the Romans. So they attacked the Romans, and we know what happened. Titus Flavius destroyed the Jewish temple, and he left with a bunch of their writings, and he left with a bunch of basically war trophies, and that's why the Arch of Titus is in Rome today, depicting what happened back then. So we're talking around between 66 and 70 AD. This is when they believe the Dead Sea Scrolls was hidden, right around this time. Now, I went through this in my last video, but understand, once the Jews lost this battle with the Romans, you got to think about it. If they really believed that they was fulfilling some kind of prophecy, if they believed that they had a Messiah or they had a warrior that was going to lead them to victory against their oppressors, when that didn't happen, of course, a lot of the Jews would lose faith. A lot of the people would start doubting their doctrine. So this was the opportunity that the Romans used to basically go ahead and instill a new doctrine. Now, this is why a lot of scholars believe that Josephus was really just the writing name of Arius Piso, because the Piso family had actually put together a doctrine that they was waiting to, put into place. They already had something ready. They had a doctrine ready to go. So now this also gave the Romans the opportunity to make it so that they are looked upon more favorably. So we know that the Caesars wanted to be worshipped as gods. We know that the Greeks wanted to be looked upon more favorably as well, because they came up with the Old Testament and it was getting ready to come up with the New Testament. So they made it so they were both looked upon more favorably, which is why we find the Greeks and the Romans all in the New Testament. I don't know how that's not suspect to so many people when you start doing this research. That is highly suspect to me. So now what do you tell these Hebrews after their whole prophecy was not fulfilled, they was defeated? You tell them it's their fault. You tell them they messed up, they broke God's covenant, or something to that effect. So when you go on and read Hebrews 8, 6 through 9, it says, "But now hath he obtained a more excellent ministry, by how much also he is the mediator of a better covenant, which was established under better promises, upon better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, then should no place have been sought for the second. For finding fault with them, he saith, Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Now, according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they continued not in my covenant, and I regarded them not, save the Lord." So now all this stuff is going on between, we're talking 66 AD and about 160 AD, around the first and second century. You got this whole Jewish war happening. You got the New Testament coming into play, and everything is changing between the Jews and the Greeks and the Christians now and the Jews. Because the whole thing is, of course, a lot of these Jews did not accept this whole New Testament, which is why today we still have Judaism and Christianity. A lot of them wasn't buying into it. Now, the reason why a lot of them wasn't buying into it was because of what St. Jerome did when he created the Latin Vulgate. He changed a lot of the Septuagint. And he basically said he did so because he was trying to correct the Hebrew. Now, the Masoretes was like the biggest critics of the Greek Old Testament and New Testament. They believe it all should be in Hebrew, and nobody can really fathom why the New Testament was in Greek and Jesus was supposed to have spoken Aramaic or Hebrew or whatever. So it was suspect. So now you got to think about it in terms of, let's look at today. We got the Old Testament today, we got the New Testament. So what if somebody came out with another testament of the Bible today? Like a whole testament, and they wanted to add it on, something after our New Testament. Now, our New Testament has revelations when everything's supposed to end. So let's say this whole next testament, let's call it, comes along and, just adds this whole doctrine that says, but wait, such and such, and changes the whole Bible. This is basically what happened to the Jews. And so you can imagine back then when they got this Old Testament and they're reading it and they're into it, then they know that the Greeks are screwing them. They know that the Romans are screwing them. Then all of a sudden, this whole New Testament comes along that makes the Romans and Greeks be looked upon favorably. So now understand, all of this history is building up to something. It's all building up to something. So stick with me, bear with me. I'm going to get into all this Hebrew mess a little bit later on, but you got to understand this Old Testament part. You got to know this history in order for me to really crush this doctrine. I got to crush this Old Testament first and show you the truth behind it, because it has been changed so much. And it's one of the things that I'm going to get into in this video about how much it was changed and why it was changed, because there's a lot you have to explain about what happened in Israel. We know it obviously was full of black people. Today it's not. How did that happen? We got to understand and realize the change that occurred. We got to look at these people differently and stop looking at the Bible as its actual history and look at actual history. The Bible is not. When you go look at the Bible, you're not looking at actual history. So I got to give you this history so you can know the truth. So bear with me. I know it's long, and if you stuck with me this long in this video, you are a true scholar or a true student, and you're trying to really understand real history. I get some people that complain about the length of videos, and I look at them like, if you can't watch, a two hour video or a 3 hour video, even a 6 hour video, I don't see you reading books. I don't see people who can't sit there and watch a video and take notes actually reading the whole book. So I look at these people as, comment thugs or jokes. Real scholars read. Real scholars, what we would love, I would love to be able to just sit down and just watch a video and get a history. So understand this history. I'm giving you books. I'm giving you so many books through the video. You can see that they pop up in the corner down there. It shows you what books to go reference. I'm giving you a lot of references because I really want you to get this history so I can break people out of this whole Bible crap. It's a shame that so many people is caught up in this mess. And now, for anybody who's really understanding what I'm saying in this video so far, when you look at it and you start learning the history, you see how stupid it really is that, once you do some research, you can figure out what basically happened. So now we know that the whole Hellenization continued up until 300 AD. So we're talking 300 AD. This is under Roman rule. So again, why would the Romans continue Hellenization? You have Judaism, and now you have Christianity, going into full swing, basically. So why would you continue to push this Hellenization and this worship of Serapis? So now you got to understand that Hellenization was the spreading of Judaism and Christianity and not Serapis. They took Serapis and changed Serapis into Jesus Christ. You got Serapis, but they basically took Osiris and the Egyptian god Apis and put them together and gave us Serapis and put a white face on them to get these black people in Egypt to worship a white god, to get everybody to worship a white god. This is what they did. And they changed them into Jesus Christ. You got Jesus Christ. Jesus is basically attributes of Zeus and of the Druidic or the Druid carpenter god, Jesus. Now, the Greeks was the first to even write about the Druids, and we first heard about the Druids from the Greeks. So now this carpenter guy, Jesus is supposed to be the son of a carpenter. Yeah, that's where his name came from. It came from this carpenter god, Jesus. So now you get Christos or Christ, which they used to call Serapis, Serapis Christos. But the first mention of a Christos is from what? It's from Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. He talks about Christos in the Odyssey on page 4 and page 252, and in the Iliad on page 23 and 186. He talks about it being oil that you put on your body when you get out of the bathtub. This is the first mention of a Christ or Christos. So now the Greeks, they also write themselves into the New Testament as being looked upon favorably. They're talking to Christ and dealing with Christ. And Christ says, you know, no matter if you're Greek or Jew, it doesn't matter. As long as you believe in me, you know, you can be saved. So when you read 1 Corinthians 1:23 to 23, it says, for the Jews require a sign, and the Greeks seek after wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, unto the Jews a stumbling block, and unto the Greeks foolishness. So the whole thing is, how are you going to get these Greeks wisdom through the Bible? And that's one of the things the Bible is about, because it teaches a lot about mathematics, especially astrology, but also physics. So when you go read Genesis 5:1, it's talking about the atom. Atom is basically the atom, not an actual man. Now, the thing is, when you read Genesis 5:1 through 2, it says, this is the book of the generations of Adam. And the day that God created man, in the likeness of God made he him. Male and female created he them, and blessed them, and called their name Adam. In the day they were created. Their name Adam. He called their name Adam. Meaning, how do you call Adam and Eve Adam? Now understand, when you read Genesis 5, it doesn't even explain what happens to Eve. It doesn't even mention Eve at all. They're clearly trying to point to something here. They're talking about the atom. So now I went through this in my previous video, and I had a lot of people jump on in the comment section and say, oh, you're an idiot. And they didn't know about atoms, you know, so long ago. And, you know, you stupid. They had people talk about that. And the whole thing is, the first mention of atoms is by Leucippus, who was from Miletus. He's a Greek. He was from Ionia. He was an Ionian. This is the first mention of atoms. Aristotle is on record as going against them, saying that, you know, they couldn't fathom something so small being so powerful. So it's on record. They knew about atoms a long time ago, way before this Bible ever came about. They knew about atoms basically before the Greeks conquered the Egyptians. They already knew about it. When you trace back and do the etymology on the word atom, it goes back to Greek, atomos. So they already knew about the atom a long time ago, which is why when you go and read Revelations, when it's talking about 666, it's talking about the atom. It's talking about man. 6 electrons, 6 protons, 6 neutrons creates carbon, which creates man. They knew about this already. I went into all this in that video. If you have not seen that video, that's Game the Bible and Christianity Finally Explained, watch it. I know it's long, but check the video out. It has a lot of information. So now we can start bringing this whole thing to a close and start really destroying this whole Hebrew Israelite doctrine and shedding some light on it. Now understand this. From 92 BCE all the way until 629 AD, the Persians returned and were at war with the Romans. So we're talking about when the New Testament was being written and created, Rome was at war with the Persians. They was already at war with them for hundreds of years. This is a long war that lasted. Now, also, because of the New Testament, you had a bunch of Jews leaving Roman-controlled countries. They was leaving Israel. They was leaving Syria. They was going out into the Middle East and going out into Africa and teaching Judaism. The Christians was doing the same thing as well. We also know the Jews was going into Arabia and trying to spread Judaism, because the Persian king Farouk was persecuting Jews in 460 AD. We know that the Jews was going into Yemen and persecuting the Christians, and they eventually took over Yemen, and they was persecuting Christians also in Ethiopia. Now in around 610 is when Islam really came onto the scene and started to spread. The Muslims eventually took over in Yemen, and it was persecuting Jews all the way up until the 20th century. We know Steven Spielberg did a whole documentary on this, and I showed a little bit of it in my video about Islam. So understand that once the whole Arab conquest started, you had the Arabs going into all of these Christian and Judaism controlled places, all these Jews and Christians who was all spread throughout the Middle East and some into parts of Africa. Once Islam began to spread, the Arabs took over. So now understand, this is one of the parts I was talking about in my last video. You got to realize that the war between the Persians and the Romans ended in a status quo antebellum, which basically means a truce. So the whole thing is, you got to look at it and say, well, how is it that the Arabs was able to use the Old Testament in their Islamic doctrine? And why would the Romans allow that? Why would the Jews allow it? So now understand that the Jews had hundreds of years to spread Judaism throughout the Arab world, throughout the Arab kingdom, throughout the Levant region, into the Middle East. As I said before, we know they went into Yemen. We know that the Jews were all over the Middle East. The Christians as well. They spread into Yemen, they spread into Syria, they spread into parts of Africa, into the Middle East, and they were both spreading this doctrine. Because one, you had basically a whole sect of Jews who was against Christianity way back then. They was persecuting the Christians way back then. A lot of the stories that you read about persecuted Christians was coming from the Jews. Coming from the Jews themselves. And a lot of people got confused and thought it was the Christians persecuting Christians when it was Jews persecuting them. People was blaming it on Rome, saying, well, that came later on with the Crusades. I'm gonna get into that, when the Christians was persecuting Christians. But before that, you had the Jews persecuting Christians. So understand, there was a pre-Islamic Arab conquest. A lot of people, they go and look at the Arab conquest and they immediately associate it with Islam. But this was before Islam really came onto the scenes. We're talking about 5th century, before Muhammad was even supposed to be born. It was an Arab conquest, and it was going in and it was taking over a lot of areas that the Jews was ruling. We know they took over Yemen and they persecuted the Jews there. But when Islam came onto the scene and a lot of those Arabs started to adopt Islam, it became a whole Islamic conquest, and they conquered a lot of areas. They came into Israel, they came into Egypt, they came into the whole Levant region, and they took over so many territories controlled by the Jews and the Christians. So understand, this is where the change occurred. This is how Egypt became full of Arabs. This is how the so-called black Hebrews got from out of Israel, and it became full of Arabs, full of Greeks, because of the Islamic slave trade which began in 650 AD. So understand, when you read Deuteronomy 28:68, and it's talking about going back to Egypt in ships, and they want you to think, these Hebrews want you to think that it's talking about America. How come it's not talking about the Muslims? The first slavery that these people that was inside of Israel occurred happened under Islam. It didn't happen in America. So why isn't Deuteronomy 28:68 talking about the Arabs, talking about the Muslims, saying that they will go into slavery under Islam? Why isn't it saying anything about that? Because the first slavery that these people endured happened under Allah, happened in Islam. And we all know this. So that's one of the things that I always point out to these so-called Hebrew Israelites, and saying, well, where's the prophecy about the Muslims? Why is it talking about slavery that's going to occur thousands of years later, when the first major slavery that they run into is under the Arabs? And they was enslaved under the Arabs for longer, twice the time that they would be enslaved under the people in America, under the Americans, under the white people there. So it's suspect as hell, like I said, but I'm going to get into Deuteronomy 28:68, because like I said, they didn't always say that. They changed that, and I'm going to show you. So now, once you take out the descendants of the ancient Egyptians from Israel, who do you have left? We know that the Greeks was there. We know that some Arabs was there. So now realize that when the Jews were spreading, when they were spreading the whole Jewish doctrine throughout the Middle East, we know that Arabs was coming into Israel. They was coming into Israel. So once the black people was enslaved, that's who you had left. You had Arabs, you had Greeks. So you had Jews and Greeks that was inside of Israel. So when you look at the people of Israel today, look at them. Take a look. Who do they look like? You can't barely tell who's Greek and who is a Jew. So look at these people. Look at this. Look at these people here. Which are they? Are these Jews or are these Greeks? These are Greek people with the Australian Prime Minister. Look at these people here. You can't tell. Are these people Jews or are they Greeks? These people are Greeks. Look at these people. Who are they? Jews or Greeks? They're Jews. It's hard for you to even tell. We can see what clearly happened in Israel. We can see the change that occurred. So you have there today a mix of basically Arab Jews and Greek Jews and Greek people. That's who are in. Those are the people who are in Israel today. Look at the flag of Israel. Look at it. Now look at the Greek flag. They're the same colors, the blue and white. Same color flag. These are the same people. They just mixed together and they've been in Israel ever since. So now when we look at history, we can see what really happened. We can see how the Arabs took over Egypt and how they are in Egypt still to this day. We can see why the people in Israel, we can see why they look the way they look. Some of them look like white people. Some of them look like Arabs. Some of them look like a mix between white people and Arabs. A lot of people couldn't really tell, which is why we get these Jews who look like this today. Because we know the Greeks was there. These people are of Greek descent. They're Greeks. That's who they are.